Will you pretend to be my husband at my father's funeral?
Will you pretend to be my husband at my father's funeral? The words hung in the air between them, and Melinda watched Song Kang's face for any reaction. They were sitting in the corner booth of a quiet cafe in downtown Atlanta, the afternoon sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His coffee sat untouched in front of him, steam rising in lazy spirals as he studied her with those dark, unreadable eyes. He didn't laugh. He didn't look shocked. He simply tilted his head slightly, the way he always did when he was considering something carefully. Your father's funeral. Yes. Melinda's hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. I know how this sounds. I know we barely know each other, but I'm desperate, and you're the only person I could think of who might actually say yes. Why would you need a pretend husband at a funeral? His voice was calm, measured, with just the slightest hint of a Korean accent softening his words. She took a shaky breath. Because my family will eat me alive if I show up alone. My father was the only one who ever defended me, who told them to leave me alone about not being married, about focusing on my career. Now he's gone and I have to face all of them. My mother, my aunts, my sister who got married at 23 and has 3 kids. They're going to spend the entire funeral looking at me with pity, asking me when I'm going to settle down, probably trying to set me up with someone's nephew. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she hated herself for it. She wasn't supposed to cry. She'd promised herself she wouldn't cry in front of him. Song Kang leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. When is the funeral? 3 days. In Savannah. It's a 2-hour drive. She swallowed hard. I would just need you for the weekend. Friday through Sunday. The wake is Friday evening, funeral Saturday, and the repast after. I drive us back Sunday morning. And what would you tell your family about me? About us? Melinda had thought about this, had the entire story mapped out in her head during the sleepless nights since her father's death. We met 6 months ago through work. You're a businessman, which is true. We kept things private because we both value our privacy, also true. We've been dating seriously for 4 months, and we're planning to tell my family soon. But then my dad died. You've thought this through. I've thought of nothing else. She finally met his eyes fully. I know this is crazy. I know I have no right to ask this of you. We've only worked together on a few events, and I'm sure you have better things to do than spend a weekend pretending to be someone's boyfriend. But I'm asking anyway because I can't face them alone. Not this time. Song Kang was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming once, twice, on the table. Then he said, I'll do it. Melinda blinked. You will? Yes. Just like that? You don't want to think about it. Something flickered across his face, too quick for her to read. You said you needed help. I'm saying yes. What else is there to think about? Relief crashed over her so powerfully that she felt dizzy. Thank you. God, thank you so much. I'll pay you obviously. Whatever you think is fair for your time. He waved a hand dismissively. I don't want your money, Melinda. Then why are you doing this? He picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and when he set it down, his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Let's just say I understand what it's like to have family expectations you can't meet. Consider it a favor from one person who gets it to another. She wanted to ask what he meant by that, wanted to dig deeper into the shadows that passed behind his eyes when he said it, but she was too grateful and too exhausted to push. Okay, a favor. Thank you. Tell me about your family, he said. If I'm going to convince them we're together, I need to know what I'm walking into. So she told him about her mother, Patricia, who ran the church women's ministry and had opinions about everything. About her older sister Denise, who was perfect in every way and never let Melinda forget it. About Aunt Gloria, who asked invasive questions disguised as concern. About the cousins and the church ladies and the whole complicated web of her father's family in Savannah. Song Kang listened, asked questions, made mental notes. He was good at this, she realized. Good at reading between the lines, at understanding the dynamics she didn't even have to explain. When she mentioned that her father had been a deacon at their church, Song Kang asked about the denomination, about what kind of service to expect. When she said her mother was traditional, he asked what that meant specifically, dress code, behavior, expectations. You're taking this very seriously, Melinda said, something like wonder in her voice. If we're going to do this, we should do it right. He pulled out his phone. Give me your number. We should meet tomorrow to get our story straight. Details matter. When did we have our first date? What do I call you when we're alone? What side of the bed do you sleep on? What side of the bed I sleep on? Someone will ask. He said it with such certainty that she didn't question him. They exchanged numbers, and as Melinda stood to leave, Song Kang stood as well. He was taller than she remembered, and there was something about the way he carried himself that made people notice him. She'd seen it the first time they met, at that corporate gala she'd planned 6 months ago. He'd been a last-minute addition to the guest list, some VIP that the hosting company desperately wanted to impress. She'd been running herself ragged making sure everything was perfect when he'd stopped her in the hallway, handed her the glass of champagne she'd been about to grab for herself, and said, "You look like you need this more than the guests do." They'd talked for 20 minutes, hidden away from the party. He'd made her laugh for the first time in weeks. When she asked what business he was in, he'd been vague. Import, export, consulting. The kind of non-answer that usually meant someone was either very boring or very private. She'd assumed the latter and hadn't pushed. Now, standing in this cafe with him agreeing to this insane plan, she wondered again what exactly Song Kang did that made him so comfortable with deception. "Melinda," he said as she turned to go. "One more thing." She looked back at him. "I'm sorry about your father." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. She managed a nod, not trusting herself to speak, and walked out of the cafe before the tears could fall. If you're already hooked by this story, do me a favor and hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me if you think Melinda is making the right choice trusting Song Kang. And subscribe because this story is about to get intense. Now back to what happened next. What Melinda didn't know as she drove home that evening, her mind already racing with relief and logistics, was that Song Kang had been waiting for an opportunity like this. Not the funeral, not her father's death. He wasn't that cruel. But a reason, any reason, to get closer to her, to be let into her world in a way that wouldn't raise her suspicions. He'd noticed her long before that gala 6 months ago. She'd been walking out of a building he'd been watching, laughing with a colleague, her head thrown back unselfconsciously. Something about her had caught his attention, made him ask his associate who she was. Melinda Crawford, event planner, 28 years old. No criminal record, no connections to his world. Clean as they came. He should have forgotten about her. There was no room in his life for distractions, and certainly not for someone who existed in the legitimate world he could never fully be part of. But he'd engineered that encounter at the gala anyway, told himself it was just curiosity. When she'd smiled at him, when they'd talked and she'd treated him like a normal person instead of with the fear or calculation he usually inspired, something had shifted. Now she'd handed him exactly what he'd wanted, access. 3 days where she would depend on him, trust him, let him into the most vulnerable moment of her life. He should feel guilty about taking advantage of her grief. The old version of himself, the one from before his father had dragged him into this life, would have felt guilty. But Song Kang had learned long ago that in his world, you took the opportunities you were given and you didn't waste time on regret. He finished his coffee and made a call. "Clear my schedule for this weekend," he told his second-in-command, a man named Min Jun who'd been with him for 5 years. "I'll be out of town." "Out of town? Boss, we have the meeting with the Nakamura group on Saturday. Reschedule it." There was a pause. Min Jun knew better than to ask too many questions, but Song Kang could hear the curiosity in his voice. "Should I send security with you?" "No. This is personal." Another pause. "You don't do personal." Song Kang smiled, though there was no humor in it. "I'm starting to." He hung up and looked out the cafe window at the Atlanta skyline. Somewhere out there, Melinda was probably already second-guessing her decision, wondering what she'd just gotten herself into. She had no idea that the man she'd asked to play her husband ran one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations on the East Coast. That his import-export consulting was a front for operations that would terrify her if she knew the details. She thought he was just a successful businessman who understood family pressure. Let her keep thinking that. Let her feel safe with him this weekend. There would be time later for truth, after he'd figured out why he couldn't get her out of his head, why the thought of her facing her grief alone had made him agree to this without hesitation. His phone buzzed. A text from Melinda. "Thank you again. I know this is weird, but I really appreciate it. See you tomorrow?" He typed back, "See you tomorrow." And Melinda? "Stop thanking me. What are fake husbands for?" She sent back a laughing emoji, and he found himself smiling at his phone like a fool. Min Jun would have told him he was being reckless. His father would have told him he was being weak, letting a woman distract him from business. They'd both be right. But Song Kang had spent the last 10 years of his life doing exactly what was expected of him, building an empire he'd never wanted, becoming the man his father had demanded he become. Maybe it was time to be reckless. Maybe it was time to want something just for himself. Consequences be damned. He finished his coffee and left the cafe, already planning for a weekend that would either be the best decision or the worst mistake he'd ever made. Have you ever done something crazy for someone you barely knew? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button because this is just the beginning. The next afternoon, Melinda met Song Kang at Piedmont Park. She'd suggested somewhere neutral, somewhere that didn't feel as heavy as her apartment or as formal as his office. They sat on a bench overlooking the lake, the late October sun warm on their faces despite the cooling air. She'd brought a notebook, bullet points already written out for their cover story. "You're very organized," Song Kang observed as she flipped it open. "It's what I do for a living. Plan things, make sure all the details line up.